So just to emphasize this, I'm glad you went into more weeds here because people on my channel are very sharp. They love the deeper, more critical let's get into the mechanics of Dr. Wright's position here because he's saying something, it resonates, what he's saying makes sense. It explains this broader picture. But what do we do with this juggernaut, I'll call it, in scholarship that is almost, I'm going to use this is going to upset some of my friends who are scholars who might watch this, but almost a dogma that you have to regurgitate in American scholarship of, documentary hypothesis is the gospel. And you start challenging that, you're fighting against, your community of academics.
Oh, yeah, they're very vicious. A lot of the scholars who are defending this documentary hypothesis, they can get very personal in their attacks. It's just, I don't know what rides on it. I don't know why they're so personally invested in it. Some of them claim not to be religious very much at all. But once you start, I think once again, it's like with the reception of the book. Things just make sense very much. And because if it weren't compelling at all, they wouldn't worry about it, right? We get angry about the things that are closest to home and closest to the truth. If it's so outlandish, who cares?
Well,
but when there's some validity to it and it seems coherent and it could be true, oh man, you're going to have to take that down and start getting ad hominem and all kinds of stuff. And it's just a mess.
Well, let's pick apart a few things if I can with you, just to get your thoughts. And some of this, keep in mind, I'm sure is in your book or would take longer than our video would allow. You have a lot of the JEDP and hypothesis out here that wants to put stuff way, way back. And they have this kind of idea that, well, you might find J way, way back here, or D.
They say all the way to King David or Solomon.
Right. And much of them will go 8th, 9th, 10th dynasty on some of these sources not dynasty, century BC. And then some of them they'll say is Persian or, granting this like final touch in the Persian. And you're saying, actually, my friends, we're crafting Persian onward, the whole picture, not saying they're not using ancient sources or ideas that might be there, but this evolution, this snowball rolling way, way back here of these materials, and then there's like composite materials that are simultaneous traditions that contradict. So the question I have about that, and I know that we're way in the weeds on trying to do this in a video, but what do you do with doublets, triplets, when there's contradictory material? Okay. Like, how do you explain what you think's happening? Whereas they see it and they go, we've got a creation account in Genesis 1, we've got a creation account in Genesis 2, and they're two completely different accounts. One's 300 years before the other. They'll throw numbers around. We don't know. But then I come to another scholar, and I'm giving both sides of the coin here, and they say, actually, if you look in Plato's Timaeus, for example, he has a cosmological ultimate crafter narrative of the divine creation of all creation, like all the earth and heavens and all. And then you have a generation of Gaia and Uranos, heaven and earth. It's a second creation where the lesser gods are actually able to create mortals. It's a separate creation story side by side in Plato. So you have Timaeus, which is giving you two creation accounts side by side. And then you have this idea that like actually Genesis 1 contradicts Genesis 2 so much. They're two separate, completely different, disparate traditions that some later scribe put together. Where are you leaning, and how would you answer some of these problems that they try to solve?
Yeah, so doublets are not an indication of two different sources. They can be in some cases, but they're not necessarily so. And those were like you point out, if there's parallels and they tell the same thing, then it must be two different sources. Here's an easier explanation to use Occam's razor. Occam's razor is if you can explain it with fewer factors, then go with that. You don't need to multiply the factors, right? If you can explain this evolved from da-da-da-da-da, you don't need to go to God to explain it. Right? That's just not helpful. And by the way, I lay that out in my book. A lot of religious people, why do we have a Bible? Well, God wanted us to have a Bible. And you're asking, well, why did we have trees? Well, trees, right? We don't make that kind of, if the wildlife biologist said, well, we have trees, or the botanist said we have trees because God wanted us to have trees, we wouldn't be going to that botanist and reading books, right? And so we have to look for the more immediate reasons. And on the two sources, the easiest way, the Occam's razor, is there's an older story, not old story, an earlier one. It's in Genesis 2. And Genesis 1 is a new attempt to tell that story, and it gets prefaced to it. So instead of two sources, you just have a text that is like a snowball. By the way, Genesis 2 is itself very late. But whatever it is, you have a text, and then you have text growing around it like a snowball as it rolls down the hill. It's not the reason why the whole documentary hypothesis emerged was not because they were trying to defend the authority of Scripture necessarily. They were doing this just because they had to explain the doublets and so forth, all the duplication. Mm-hmm. This goes way back into the 1800s. But it has become, within scholarship for the last 50 years, a conservative position, because one could use it to say there are independent sources, and they tell the same story roughly, that God created the earth, and that there was an Exodus, that there's Abraham. There are two sources that mention Abraham, and it's like, no, there is an older story that tells about Abraham, and there are new additions to that story. And the older story itself is not very old, because, by the way, Jacob is Israel. Right. And what they want to do with Abraham, by saying Abraham was Jacob's grandfather, was to create a new figure at a very late point that would unify. Jacob remembers Israel, the north, and if it's all the northern traditions, the Judeans need somebody who says, this is our ancestor, and he was before Jacob. And Abraham, if you remember, he's down in Hebron and in Judah in the south. So they use a southern ancestor, and he's a late invention. There are Greek influences there too. Thomas Romer, a very respected scholar, talks about Moses and Abraham by comparing Greek sources. And by the way, we know so much about Moses, or we have a lot of stories about Moses from late Hellenistic sources about how he's a warrior and so forth. And you see how Moses in this period, in the Hellenistic period, is really getting a lot of traction. And so to put it simply, there is an earlier story, not an old story, but an earlier story. And then there are responses to it, and there are attempts to say, well, let's do a new version of that. And they grow. And
is it safe to say that they started that task post-destruction? So the older story may have actually been one of the earliest things they had initially started post-destruction. Yeah. And then it rolls from there. Is that your...
Exactly. And so it's not like when I say older that it goes all the way back to some kind of historic memory or something. It's just an attempt to connect the dots and to create a myth that will unify dispersed, exiled communities and say, listen, we were connected already back then. And then people say, well, let's nuance that a little bit more and add some other things. And they tell the story twice. And the story that comes before it is the one that gets preference, because the best way to reorient a work is not to add a new appendix to it, because no one will get to it. It's always to add the introduction. And there's a great scholar, Sarah Milstein, who talks about redaction through introduction, meaning you take a text and you redact it by putting a new introduction, so that when one reads everything after it, one reads through the lens of that new text. And that can be demonstrated by across the Bible, but a lot of other kinds of materials from the ancient world.